Russia is the number one information aggressor in the world. If it is the number one threat, where are the resources? If we allow Russia to conduct these operations without any punishment, then other aggressors will see this. Other aggressors will use the weapon because they see we don't punish Russia for using it.
Do you still feel like our efforts are under budgeted?
That's exactly my worry. If you merge the Chinese resources with the Russian know-how and experience and practice, this is quite a dangerous cocktail.
What's the most ridiculous disinformation campaign you've seen?
Oh, if anybody wants to be serious about fighting Russian disinformation, they should learn from the Ukrainians. They tried the most, they know the most, they experience the most. It's the best place to learn about fighting Russian propaganda.
Welcome to Soup Talk. There are not many people in the world who know more about Russian online disinformation than Jakub Kalenský. He's currently working at the European Center of Excellence for Countering Hybrid Threats and was previously launching the fantastic EU versus Disinfo campaign. If you're interested in Kremlin-organized disinformation machinery, this interview is for you. Hope you enjoy it. Could you briefly introduce yourself? Who are you? What do you do? What's your favorite soup?
Right. Is it obligatory to say vatnik soup on this show? No. Yeah, no. Ever since I moved to Finland, lohikeito is great. Salmon soup is lovely, but it's still probably the Vietnamese pho is probably still top of the list. So my name is Jakub. I specialize on disinformation. Most often it's Russian disinformation because it's most often the Kremlin that is spreading disinformation. And I've been working on this topic in the last 9 years, first in the European Union in Brussels. I was part of the East Stratcom, which is a team that is running the EU versus Disinfo campaign. Then I worked in the Atlantic Council in the Digital Forensic Research Lab, and now I work here in Helsinki in the Hybrid Center of Excellence.
All right. Let's do a brief travel ad. You've lived in Finland, like you said, you've lived here for quite some time. What do you like about the country?
Oh, where do I start? I think it's really good for my mental health. I think Finns are teaching me to be a bit more patient and tolerant and probably also a better work-life balance. I think I used to be a bit more workaholic before I moved here. So it's making me a calmer person, I would say.
That's the best ad you can have for Finland. So the happiest country in the world, like 6 times in a row. So maybe that's the reason there.
I'm not even surprised.
But you worked as a journalist previously in Czech Republic, right?
Yes.
Maybe you can tell me a little bit about that. What was that about?
Before 2015, before I went to Brussels, I worked as mainly as a political correspondent and in a few newsrooms, also a bit of an investigative journalist. But I was covering mainly domestic politics. On the other hand, when you cover domestic politics and then you cover Russian propaganda, you could say there is not that much change. You are always looking, what is the fact behind what the politicians are saying? And you just switch the Czech politicians for the Kremlin.
But then eventually you got into researching disinformation. But what was it that initially got you interested in this topic?
It was actually quite straightforward. What got me interested was that there was this advertisement for the job in Brussels. We are building a new team to fight Russian disinformation. We are looking for people who have a background in communication, in journalism, and also understand Russian. I had a master's in Russian. I studied Russian and philosophy in Prague, and I had a background in journalism. So I applied and I made the interview.
And you were one of the creators. Did you start this project, EU versus Disinfo? Because it's a very famous project that's also been attacked by many pro-Kremlin, let's say, actors. Is this one of your creations?
Happy to hear that. That's kind of a badge of quality, isn't it? Yes, the team started in 2015. I think the full team started in September. There were a few people a few months before that. And we launched this EU versus Disinfo campaign in October or November. So it was one of the first things that we came up with. And I guess it's not a too big exaggeration to say that in the first years it was mainly me. Then in the second year we got a Swedish secondment, so we were 2 people working full time on that, and then we got a Finnish colleague, so we were 3 people working on that full time. But obviously you couldn't do this alone, so we drew heavily on the time of other people in the team.
Were you already back then collaborating with any Ukrainian organizations or?
Absolutely. We had no budget for the project, so that was the main problem. And if you want to So the whole aim of the EU versus disinfo campaign was to try and detect and expose Russian disinformation campaigns. You couldn't really call it that much countering of it. We were really in the mode that we need to expose it more. We need to raise awareness about this more before we can actually move to the next stage. And obviously in one person or in two people, you can't really monitor what the Russians are spreading in some 24 languages in 28 countries. So after Brexit, it was 27. We drew heavily on the expertise of researchers and activists, journalists in all the countries that we worked with. And obviously Ukraine, since they were always on the front line of this Russian information aggression, they were the most helpful by far. Be it, the veterans of the counter disinformation business like Stop Fake, but also individuals like the late Sasha Nikonorov, who unfortunately died, I think, in 2017 in an accident that was later classified as a murder. So we had help from a lot of brave, brilliant people in Ukraine. I still think that if anybody wants to be serious about fighting Russian disinformation, they should learn from the Ukrainians. They tried the most, they know the most, they experienced the most. It's the best place to learn about fighting Russian propaganda.
All right. We touched this topic briefly, but why are we mostly talking about Russian disinformation and propaganda? Are they simply the biggest, or what is the reason for that?
Russia is the number one information aggressor in the world, and we are not talking by 1%. We are talking head and shoulders above the rest. The Princeton University, they had a project about foreign influence efforts, and according to their database, Russia is responsible for over 60% of foreign influence efforts in the world globally. So that's half as much as the rest of the world combined. But this is not even the worst. In Europe, based on the estimates which were published, I believe, in the report published by the French government several years ago, the estimates talk about Russia being responsible for 80% of information influence efforts in Europe. So 4 times as much as all the other actors combined. This makes them easily, by far, the biggest threat in the information space. Not that many people realize that when they have a look at the so-called domestic disinformers, that they very often just parrot the lies that were planted by the Russian disinformation ecosystem. The lies about, Brussels has banned the word mother and father, and they are forcing us to talk about parent 1, parent 2. You would see a lot of pseudo-conservative actors repeating this disinformation, but it started in the Russian disinformation ecosystem. A lot of the lies about George Soros, I know them first time I saw them in the Russian disinformation ecosystem, only later elsewhere. A lot of the traditional values lies are originating in the Russian disinformation ecosystem. So Russia is the biggest provider of lies in Europe, I would say, by far.
But are online disinformation and propaganda, are they effective? And if they are, why?
I fear it is still effective. Measuring the impact, measuring the success of disinformers is one of the hardest disciplines, but I think it's not impossible. We actually just recently published a report on that. For example, some opinion polls can tell you approximately how the Russian disinformers are successful. And when you try and measure how many people believe typical Russian lies, like the West is to blame for the war in Ukraine, there's nothing more black and white who's to blame for the war, isn't there? But you would see, based on the opinion polls, that there can be 15, 20, 30, even 40% of a population believing in this disinformation narrative. Obviously, the situation is better in the Baltic countries and in the north of Europe, Finland, Sweden, Poland. But as soon as we go more south, perhaps even more west, suddenly you have countries where you have 30, 40% of people believing in this disinformation campaigns. So that's one way how to have a look at the success. Another way how to have a look at the success is, are the politicians who are repeating Russian lies successful? And, if we have a look at the very recent elections in Slovakia and the Netherlands, I think the Kremlin is very happy about these outcomes, very happy. And then you can have a look at some real life incidents, like about the Pizzagate shooter, Edgar Welch, who drove all the way from North Carolina to Washington, D.C. to fire the gun to protect the kids against this horrible pedophile conspiracy. I mean, this is clearly a success of disinformation campaigns, isn't it? We had a very similar case in the Czech Republic, actually, where a pensioner tried to derail a train and blame it on the Muslims because he was brainwashed by the disinformation outlets that Muslims are a big threat and Czechs are not afraid of them enough. So he tried to stage a crime that he would blame on the Muslims. When we have these cases, we can't say that disinformers aren't exactly successful. I mean, they clearly achieve success. Some people are willing to kill because of disinformation campaigns. It's quite scary, isn't it?
Yeah, I talked with a Czech colleague, and he said that in Czech Republic, elderly people are using these mailing lists to spread message. So they don't really use the traditional social media rather than sending emails or this kind of stuff. So through a mailing list, they are being informed about these conspiracy theories, and then they spread throughout the elderly population and so on. And in Latvia, television is still playing a big role because of the Russian dominance in the media space there. So they still apply a lot of different strategies in different countries and for different target groups and segments. So it seems to be a very clever system that they're using.
Absolutely, precisely. That's what I'm not such a big fan if the whole problem gets reduced to social media, because this is just not the case. I mean, there's still a lot of trouble happening in other channels, be it traditional media, and sometimes it doesn't even have to be Russian-owned. I mean, almost every Kremlin conspiracy about the war in Ukraine, Bucha massacre was staged. You would find it repeated by some Western outlets. That's quite scary again. So there's still a lot of trouble in other segments of the information space apart from social media. So I wouldn't reduce the problem just on the platforms.
Have you noticed any positive trends in efforts to fight disinformation in general, online, social media, or in other?
It seems to me that the awareness is rising a bit. So the situation is now significantly different than it was in 2015. You would find more politicians being aware of the threats. More often they are speaking up. You would see even more aggressive rhetoric towards the Kremlin and their propaganda, which I think is absolutely necessary. But I guess my fear is whether our movement in the right direction isn't still comparatively slower to the Russian movement in their direction. So even if we set on the right course, and if the Russians run 2 times faster than we are running, they will still just increase the gap between their achievements and our defense. So that's my chief worry. So I guess we are moving in the right direction, just horribly, horribly slowly.
There's been some articles that have suggested that Russia has this Maidan 3 campaign that has a price tag of $1.5 billion or something. Whether or not that's correct, do you still feel like our efforts, especially in Europe, are under budgeted? We're not spending enough on this matter to fight against Russian disinformation?
That's exactly my worry. And this estimate, $1.5 billion US, if I remember it correctly, is counting only the white outlets. The difference between the white, gray, and black propaganda channels. And I think this 1.5, this is counting only the white channels, only the outlets that do not hide their affiliation to the Kremlin. But it does not cover the disinformation ecosystem that is claiming we are the only independent alternative to the lying mainstream, but they are just parroting Russian propaganda as well. It doesn't cover the infamous troll factory. It doesn't cover all the Russian gongos that are also spreading Russian disinformation and propaganda. It doesn't really cover the funds and foundations like sponsoring or grants for creating of patriotic content on the internet, which is again another part of the Russian disinformation machine. So this 1.5 figure is likely just a fraction of what the Russians are spending, but it's the fraction we can identify. Whereas if you take the budget of, for example, my previous team, which in the first 3 years had budget 0, then it had budget 1 million euros, and I think the latest figure I saw was 12 million. I mean, we are still talking about Russians outnumbering this unit 100 times, maybe several hundred times. We don't even know how much precisely. So with this difference in resources, it doesn't even matter that we might be defending the right values, that we might be speaking the truth. Because with this difference of resources, Russians will simply beat us with the numbers. It's the old Stalinist approach that quantity has a quality of its own.
Yeah, there's this system of firewalls of falsehood where you just like push so much information that it's very difficult to find the truth, whatever it is, from there. So yeah, it's quite worrying.
There is one more threat to this fact that the Russians are trying so much in the information space. It's not just they are throwing in big numbers in the information arena and they can overwhelm the information domain. They are also learning a lot about what does not work. If you try everything, then you very clearly learn, very quickly you realize what is a good measure, what is a bad measure, which message works in which audience, which channels work in which audience. They have gained an enormous amount of practice in the last few years. And I still fear that Russians know our audiences much better than we do, especially when it comes to spreading disinformation. So that's another big advantage they have. And that's an advantage that's a result of this big investment they keep making for the last more than a decade.
But it still seems like it's like a black box in many ways. We don't know much about it. We have some figures, we have some numbers, but at least, I mean, I feel like I'm relatively educated about the topic, but I still feel like it's a huge black box. Like, how is it funded? How are some of these people paid, and how are they paid? And like, do you know if there are some efforts to actually uncover all the whole black box, to open it?
I'm actually just discussing it with a few people who are involved in trying to monitor this. I would love to see the full picture as well. I think this is precisely part of the problem, that we see only the tip of the iceberg. And I think we see quite a representative tip of the iceberg when it comes to the messages and the narratives of the Russian disinformation campaign. I think we have quite a good idea what are they trying to spread. You can identify it even if you have a look at just 10% of what they are spreading. Just following Solovyov's shows or Kiselyov's shows already tells you a lot. But I think we really lack the answers to some questions about the quantitative aspects of the whole machine. How many channels are there? How many messages per day they spread? How many people do they target? How many people do they persuade? Is this number increasing or decreasing? Are we winning or are we losing? You know, imagine you would be fighting a COVID pandemic without having the slightest idea about how many people got the virus, how many people are vaccinated, how many people died, how many people are in the hospital. But this is the situation we are in with disinformation campaigns. We don't have these numbers, but we are somehow supposed to fight this war.
That's depressing. A little bit.
It's a bit frustrating, yeah.
But is there any light at the end of the tunnel?
Well, as I said, I think we are moving in the right direction. I just really think that the movement should be significantly faster. It's hard to imagine what would need to happen for us to finally step up, because the Russians have been giving us a lot of signals that they are quite serious about this, haven't they? They are very obvious that for them, information is just another part of military measures. You know, it's not just that Shoigu talks about it publicly or Peskov, we are in an information war. It's also that the Russian Ministry of Defense, they are giving medals to the pseudo-journalists for participating in a war. Not for journalism, not for reporting, for participating in a war. They did that in 2016 during the war in Syria. They were doing it again after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. So they make it very clear journalists are part of the rank and file of our military. Do we see this understanding in the West? Do people of the West understand that for Russia this is a military measure? You know, we would oppose Russian tanks in the streets of Warsaw, I hope, or Paris or Berlin, but we don't have the same reaction to Russian disinformation and propaganda.
You've seen a lot of these campaigns. What's the most unbelievable and ridiculous disinformation campaign you've seen?
Oh, I guess you can't even call it a campaign because it was like a message, but it was part of a bigger campaign. I think my favorite story was from a Czech pseudo-media outlet. I think it was back in 2016. And this was a story that was targeting Angela Merkel and her pro-refugee policy, which was obviously a big target of the disinformation ecosystem. And they made up a story in which they combined so many factors you can't even imagine it. So they said that the German government has to satisfy the needs of the migrants on every level. including the sexual needs. So they have to buy them prostitutes. But obviously the German prostitutes are too expensive, so they have to buy Czech prostitutes because they are cheaper. And the Czech prostitutes are then coming back to the Czech Republic with the sexually transmitted diseases of the refugees back to the Czech Republic and spreading these diseases in the Czech Republic, which is all an elaborate plan of Angela Merkel how to punish Czech Republic for not accepting the refugee quotas.
Okay, that's some 4-dimensional chess, like proper plan. I mean, yeah, that's actually very funny.
Yes, they have a lot of fun when they are creating these. Yeah.
There's some strong evidence. Well, actually, there's strong evidence Russia has received assistance from Iran, North Korea, and the Chinese Communist Party for their conventional war in Ukraine. But is Russia collaborating with these countries in online operations too?
There have been reports, and I think even signed agreements between the Chinese and Russian government about cooperation in the information domain. There were exchange programs between the Russian and Chinese pseudo-media. So there is a lot happening, even in what we have in the publicly available sources. But I presume there is even more happening behind the curtains where we can't see it. So yes, there is collaboration. I think this is a very, very big threat because what we saw earlier with the Chinese information operations was that they were kind of clumsy. Maybe they didn't know the target audience that well. Maybe they were not that skillful in actually conducting a disinformation campaign. But they have the resources, right? Which is what the Russians lack. So if you merge the Chinese resources with the Russian know-how and experience and practice, this is quite a dangerous cocktail. And I think this is another big threat in us not reacting properly against this threat. That if we allow Russia to conduct these operations without any punishment, which is unfortunately still happening, then other aggressors will see this. Other aggressors will use the weapon because they see we don't punish Russia for using it. And China is unfortunately a significantly bigger actor, like resources-wise. So we might be facing a significantly bigger trouble in the future.
What should the reaction be from the West?
Significantly more robust. I mean, just take the fact that in the last year before the full-scale invasion, 2021, the biggest advertisers on Russian state TV were many Western companies. Many Western companies were financing anti-Western propaganda. How is that possible? How come these companies had not been sanctioned before? I mean, they were very clear, even before the full-scale invasion, they were very clear in their aggressive intentions. Vladimir Solovyov, you made a video about him. His genocide rhetoric didn't start in February 2022. He was speaking like that in 2016, 2017. What were we doing? We weren't listening. So just sanctioning all of the Russian channels, all of them, and all of the individuals that work in them, and everybody who collaborates with them, that would at least cut them off some money. So that should be the first step, in my opinion. If we cut them off the resources, then we don't have to deal with such a big problem. The problem would be at least a little bit smaller. But then, obviously, there are many, many other countermeasures that we need to be talking about. And many of them have been already implemented. I like to talk about these 4 lines of defense, that we need to do these 4 big groups of countermeasures. We need to be better at detection and documentation of what the Russians are doing. And we discussed that there is a lot of information we don't have yet. So we need to try and get the answers to these questions. The second group, second line, is raising awareness. We need to make sure that there are more people aware of what kind of threat we're facing. And here the number of actors is really key. So it can't be just the governments. It also has to be the civil society, the media. It has to be YouTubers, influencers, because each of them will have a different target audience. This is something that the Russians understand so well. That's one of the reasons why they are throwing so big numbers in the information arena, because they know that the audiences nowadays are significantly more fragmented. You can't hope that you will reach 80% of audience with one communication product. So raising awareness would be the second big thing we need to be doing. The third big thing we need to be doing is repairing the weaknesses in the information ecosystem. So that's where the pressure on social media platforms comes. but also media literacy programs to kind of raise the bar that the disinformers have to overcome. And the fourth line is about trying to limit and punish and deter the information aggressors. And this is something where we hadn't been doing a very good job before 2022. And that's why the problem is so big now. We allow them to grow almost unopposed. Russians face close to no consequences for these activities. Take just a look their election meddling. I think the Mueller investigation so far is still the only proper investigation into Russia's interference into an election or referendum. In Europe, we had 20 elections and referenda targeted by the Russians, and I don't know about a single similar investigation. The message is, feel free to do this. We are not even looking into it. But if you don't investigate it, you can't even punish the perpetrators. That's a bit problematic. We don't do this. It's really difficult to understand. I think this is also one of the biggest successes of Russian disinformation and propaganda. They are effectively paralyzing us into inaction many, many times. It's not just in the information space. It's also with the support of Ukraine. Their disinformation campaign, if you support the victim of my aggression, something terrible will happen. They were doing it after 1956 Hungary, after 1968 Czechoslovakia, 1979 Afghanistan. They are doing it again now. The thing that Russians are repetitive shows that they have very low inventiveness, that they are stupid in their campaigns. My fear is that when Russians are repeating something that they had been repeating for decades, is because they know it works.
You already mentioned the Baltic countries, the Nordic countries, Poland. But in your opinion, which countries have fared well against Russian disinformation, and what have they done?
If we take the data from the opinion polls, like, for example, how many people believe in various Russian disinformation campaigns, you could see that the lowest numbers are in the 3 Baltic countries, in the Nordic countries. I think the factors are a little bit different. So in these 2 regions, in the Nordic countries, it's the very high media literacy, which is great, but also very strong institutions, which are significantly less politicized than in other countries of the world. I mean, just take a look at the United States. And there is a bigger cohesion in the society, like lower polarization, a little bit less of these problems like dividing lines between the capital and the countryside, between the younger generation and older generation, between the better educated and less educated. So I think the more cohesive society you have, the more you decrease the weaknesses that the aggressors are targeting. We see that they are always aiming for these divisive topics, dividing lines. They are trying to make them worse. I think despite the fact that Baltic countries have done so much work in the last decades, I don't think they are there yet with the Nordic countries when it comes to media literacy. Maybe Estonia has a brilliant media literacy program, but the trust into institutions or the cohesion of the society, maybe that's not there as high as in the Nordic countries. But I think there they simply have the most experience with Russia, apart from Ukraine now. And I think this plays a very, very big role. So, in some countries, you could see the politicians during their campaigning, they could even differ on how they perceive the Russian threat because it brings them some votes. You would not really see this in Lithuania or Latvia. It seems to me that like all the information elite understands that Russia is a threat and that you can't play with the card that you would underestimate the threat. So I think the experience with Russian aggression is there the highest, and maybe this is one of the factors that helps them so much.
You recently published a paper titled "How Ukraine Fights Russian Disinformation: 10 Key Lessons from the Frontline for the West," together with Roman Oshachuk. I'm not sure. Hopefully, I pronounced that correctly.
Very good.
But what do you think are the key takeaways from this paper?
We actually try to order it in the order how important we think it is, and the first lesson says you have to take it significantly more seriously, and this is where I think many Western countries are still failing. They still don't perceive this as such a high level threat as you would see in Ukraine. Once you take it more seriously, you do the basic work, kind of laying the foundation of the counter-disinformation building. You have to lay the foundation very strongly. So there is a lot of effort, a lot of work dedicated to these basic activities like detection, documentation, debunking. In some of the Western countries, you would hear this myth that debunking doesn't work. I'm not really sure where it originated because it's not even supported by academic research. But Ukrainians didn't fall for this myth. They debunk a lot on a daily basis, very often even from the highest level, like the president or ministers. But in order to do all this work, this detection, this documentation, this debunking properly, you really need to throw in very big resources. So the numbers are the second key lesson. Unless you have the numbers in the information arena, you will not succeed. So Ukrainians they have significantly higher resources in the counter-disinformation industry, if you want to call it that way, than any country in the West, and yet they still understand they are outnumbered by the Russians. Another key thing is that the state does not have enough resources, and they have to rely on the civil society. You can't hope that you will defeat this problem on your own. And again, this is something that you would not see in many Western countries. I mean, somewhere it's really good. I think the Lithuanian government has a really good cooperation with the Lithuanian civil society, but you don't see it in every country. In some countries, you would even see the governments or the politicians portraying civil society as their enemy, which is seriously unhelpful if you face a much stronger enemy, which Russian disinformation is. So Ukraine relies a lot on the civil society. I think you could even say that in the first year of this renewed Russian information aggression following the protests on Maidan and the entries of Crimea, first invasion of Donbass, it was the civil society that was leading in this counter-disinformation. It wasn't the government. The government joined only a bit later. So without the civil society, you can't hope that you would succeed. So this covers more or less the first 3 or 4 lessons.
But it's a great paper, and I really suggest everybody read it, at least parts of it, because I really enjoyed it.
Happy to hear that. Thank you.
What are your thoughts on social media movements like NAFO, however you want to pronounce it?
I mean, just as I said, we desperately need bigger numbers. So many thanks to everybody who joins the fight, and we really need every single individual. This is precisely what they understand in Ukraine, and many thanks to everybody in the NAFO movement that they understand it as well. Every voice matters, every comment matters, every like, every share matters. So please keep going. Thank you for your work.
To me, it's a big surprise how big it still is. Like, it's very resilient in a sense. Like, if you look at some other social media movements, like we have Kony 2012 and this kind of, so it's still very big and it's even growing still. Some people are leaving, more people are coming in, and it's the decentralized nature of the movement is also a very big strength of it. So it's very difficult to attack these kind of movements because there's no leader. Who do you attack? And the humor, and I think it's a good weapon. I think the humor was also mentioned in the paper that you
exactly
published.
Yeah. Exactly. No, humor can really help you to reach beyond your typical audiences. And it's not a weapon that only civil society can use. We can see that whenever governments try to be at least remotely funny, they immediately get more retweets. Some of the funnier products, they even make it to headlines of big media, which is an impact that you can't reach with every government statement. So yes, I would very much encourage humor. But as with every measure, I think it's really good to bear in mind, you won't solve the whole problem with it. It's really good to keep up the morale of the fighters. It's really good to ridicule the Russian disinformers. But for example, what we know from research is that it's a really bad weapon when you are trying to persuade somebody who already believes the disinformation campaigns. There is a little bit of a backfire effect that they will get even more angry. So you have to be quite careful for which audiences you would use it. You can't use it for everybody. But this is valid for any countermeasure that there is. I mean, none of them is a silver bullet solution. None of them solves the whole problem.
Is there kind of an archetype of people who fall for this kind of Russian narratives, conspiracy theories? Is there any research on this, or publications or papers on this?
I would like to see more. I've seen only very anecdotal research on this. One of the reports I recall was covering only the United States, and perhaps not so surprisingly, they came to the conclusion that if you are more leaning towards the Republicans, you are probably more vulnerable to disinformation campaigns. I think they also established that older people, and I think also more males than females, so they were identifying these risk groups. But this was limited to the United States. I don't think that it has to be the same, for example, in the European countries. I would like to see more research on that. I think it goes back to this first line, this detection and documentation. We still need to get answers to so many questions. Unfortunately, we don't have those. And I still don't understand how is it possible. If you are trying to sell a toothpaste, you have a good market research, you know who is your customer, you know how to reach them. Here we face a significantly bigger problem than selling a toothpaste, and we don't have this information. And this is only because of the lack of resources.
What are your thoughts on AI? Is it a threat? Democracy, free elections, and so on?
I think I see two aspects where the AI might help the bad actors a lot. One of them is this element of numbers that we discussed, that a lot of it is about how much do you throw in the information space. So the AI can really help them with the mass production. I think that's a bit of a problem. Another element where I think it could be a problem is the language barrier. You remember when the Russians were trying to spread the message here in Finland that NATO will not save you, they made this comical mistake, which you will probably explain better than I will.
Yeah, so there was this translation error that NATO will not save you, and it was auto-translated to Finnish, and I think it was something like, it referred to saving a file on your computer, so NATO will not
for you.
Yeah. But it was quite funny, and it actually made the Finnish headlines. But yeah, the network still exists. Those accounts are still
sure.
So some of them, so they didn't really do any adjustments.
Right.
It just keeps going.
Right. Well, they might be using them for a future campaign. So I think the AI can help you to produce content with better language quality. I think the AI will get better in translation, or maybe already is better in translation than the normal translator tools that we see. But I think it's good to bear in mind that it's just a tool. The good actors could be using it just as well as the bad actors. So again, we're going back to the question of resources. If Russians have more people working on this topic and more people playing with AI tools to do bad things, then we have to actually counter this problem. It's not so much a problem of the particular tool, it's still a problem of the resources, it's a problem of the will to fight.
Okay, so to conclude, 3 things that Europe, EU needs to do to fight Russian disinformation effectively. I think you mentioned them, but maybe we can kind of do a summary of them again, because we have to really push.
What is most needed is really deep understanding that what we are facing is a significantly bigger threat than what our reaction involves. That it was even in one of the documents published by the EU, I think it was the action plan on disinformation back in 2018, that Russian disinformation is the number one threat to the EU. If it is the number one threat, where are the resources? I mean, how come this has not happened? So this understanding that we are dealing with a military measure and a military threat, and our response should be symmetrical to this. I think this understanding would be the first condition which should enable some other step. The second step, I think, we need significantly bigger resources, and I'm not talking about a team of 10 should become a team of 12. I'm talking more about a team of 10 should become a team of 300 people. I mean, significantly bigger resources in the counter-disinformation domain. But we also need, more private donors financing more civil society activities. When you talk to the people in the civil society, in the NGOs, in the think tanks, they have a problem with money, and they very often rely on budgets from the US and UK, not so much, for example, from Europe, which is a bit troubling. So we need more resources. And then it's really hard to decide which of the lines I would pick. I think we desperately need more work in all 4 of them, but maybe I would pick the first one and the fourth one, because I think we are doing quite a good job in the second one and the third one. We are doing quite a good job in raising awareness. We are doing quite a good job in trying to repair the weaknesses in the information system, like pressure on social media companies. EU is actually leading on that. But when it comes to the documentation, we still need much more data to understand the scope of the problem. And as you were actually asking, like, who are the people who are consuming it the most? And the fourth line, we need to make it harder for the disinformers. We need to decrease their resources. We need to decrease their will to cause harm. Because as long as we don't impose any costs on them, they will just keep adapting to our defense. And we already see it happening. You know, when the social media introduced fighting of this coordinated and authentic behavior, Russians changed, adjusted their practice, and they started pretending that they are more authentic, like buying off Facebook pages of real people and spreading disinformation from there. So if we don't impose any costs on them, they just keep adapting, they keep causing harm. So we need to limit their capability, we need to limit their resources to do so.